Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, you know there's that theory, people say it from time to time about, in different contexts, different schools of thought, and kind of gets dismissed as crankishness sometimes, that higher rates can be a contributor to inflation.
Yes. And actually, I'm hearing this more and more, interestingly enough. So you used to hear, little rumblings of it every once in a while, but I swear in the past 2 or 3 months, a lot of people have been talking about this. And I guess the basic idea here is there's always been some question about the efficacy of interest rates in the current inflationary environment. So if you think back to the 2020 period, the idea that we had all these supply disruptions, lots of snarls in transportation and logistics, what are interest rate hikes really going to do in that context, right?
Yeah.
And some people even argue that higher interest rates are detrimental for that kind of inflation because you make it harder for people to build out capacity.
Yeah.
But what's happening more recently, and I think you're hearing more talk of this, is the idea that higher interest rates in and of themselves can contribute to the inflationary impulse through the interest income channel.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, there's a bunch of people that own treasuries and then they get a payment, I guess, every month, and that is income into the economy. And then when you're fighting inflation, that's the more I think that's one of the arguments for how higher rates can be inflationary. But then there is there is the more agreed upon view that you mentioned, which is that higher rates can then strain investment and contribute to less housing, and that has an inflationary impulse in a time of housing shortage. That seems to be a little less controversial. The connection is clear. But I think regardless, okay, here we are in July 2024. Inflation has come down a lot. There's still many stories that could be told a lot about the last 4 years. And I don't think there are any really economists who have nailed this cycle with some theory or whatever that it's yep, they explained how it's all going to work. There are many, this period, whatever we've experienced over the last 4 years, will be debated and argued about, and what role did higher rates have in bringing down inflation, or will be debated by economists for 100 years probably.
I find this aspect of our life right now simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. So It's great that we're learning about how the world works. It's also terrifying that we still aren't entirely sure how interest rates work and what impact they actually have on the economy. But I am very, very interested in digging into more of this argument, the interest income channel here, and the actual push and pull of higher interest rates on inflation. I think we should talk more about it.
Totally. Well, I'm really excited. We do indeed have the perfect guest, someone we've never had on the show before, but he's someone who we get a lot of requests for on Twitter, on the Outlaws Discord, someone we probably should have had on a long time ago. We are going to be speaking to Warren Mosler. He's an economist, former investment manager. He drives fast race cars in the Virgin Islands. Currently, he's on a bike trip in Croatia, a very cool life. He is also the originator of what has come to be known as modern monetary theory. So, Warren, thank you so much for coming on Outlaws.
Good to be here, and enjoyed listening to the introduction.
How do we do?
You said it all.
Okay.
We're done here.
Why don't you give us thanks. That was great. Why don't you give us your summary? So someone said, higher rates cause inflation. I think there's even, there's a neo-Fisherian school that I think the Turkish president subscribes to. How would you characterize what that means or what's going on?
Well, I look at what is. Okay. I look at the numbers. I look at the data, and I try and make sense of it, just like everyone else. And my narrative has been different from everyone else's, at least up until recently, from listening to you. And it's nothing more than that. Where to start? I wrote my first paper on this in, I think, 1997, called The Natural Rate of Interest is Zero. So it's not something new to me. And myself and my partner, Cliff Viner, back in the 1980s, we always used to muse about how the best indicator of what M2 growth would be is LIBOR, because the interest rate itself determines the money supply growth as it was measured back then. There've been institutional changes since then, but this was back in the 80s. And so the idea that the interest rate itself was instrumental in how the price level moves over time. Now, notice I'm going to avoid using the word inflation rate.
Okay.
I may say inflation indicators from time to time, but that is the whole word and term has gotten so confused by the way it's been used. If tomatoes go up, that's tomato inflation or something, right? Instead of just the price of tomatoes going up. That it's not informative the way I'd like it to be. So, excuse me for not using that word maybe as much as you all do. Yeah. So the interest rate itself has had this effect on the price level, for a long time that I've observed. Okay, it's 1980. That's 45 years, right? Something interesting happened this cycle compared to prior cycles. Now, in prior cycles, like in 2008, I was saying back then that the rate cuts, the Bernanke rate cuts, were probably not going to do much for the economy, if anything, because cutting the rates from 5.5 to 0 or whatever it was at the time removed something like $400 billion a year of interest income from the economy. It lowered the deficit by $400 billion from what it otherwise would have been. And all that income and those net financial assets were no longer being added. So I was looking at a very sluggish recovery. I didn't see the stimulus packages being large enough to cause a particular boom. It was plenty large enough for decent growth, but not any kind of a runaway inflationary boom or anything like that. And I can recall being at the Fed at a private meeting with a guy named Dave Wilcox, who was talking about quantitative easing and how he didn't think it would be inflationary. And I said, yeah, I'm not so much worried about it not being inflationary, but with the Fed buying all these securities, okay, they were buying securities that had higher yields, and they were paying for them with reserves, adding reserves, which is fine. It was changing the duration of the government holdings. But it went from, the Fed was now earning the high interest rates, and the market was earning the 0% or whatever they were paying on reserves at the time. It was very low. And I said, they're effectively taking $90 billion a year of interest income out of the economy. That might have been 0.5%, 1% of GDP at the time. I thought for that reason, quantitative easing would probably slow down the economy at that point in time.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's kind of what happened.
So initially,
now, you can't prove it.
You kind of looked at it from the opposite side of where we are today. So the idea that QE was sucking out income rather than higher interest rates adding to it.
And that was based on the yield curve at the time and duration of government debt, everything at the time. It was and the data seemed to play that. Now, I don't know if it's just confirmation bias on my part, but it looked to me like that's what happened. And we did have this sluggish economy. And that was partially the reason that the deficit wasn't large enough, partially because the interest. Now, I'm categorically against using a positive interest rate policy to increase deficit spending to support an economy because it's so obscenely regressive. When they raise rates, the only thing they do is pay interest to people who already have money in proportion to how much they already have. Okay, and you increase deficit spending that way.
Just to be clear, you may say that lower rates or QE or whatever, that they're not particularly stimulative, but that's very different than saying, that a good form of stimulus would be higher rates.
Yeah, I'd rather have low rates and a tax cut.
Yeah.
Than high rates and a tax increase, right?
Sure. So let's bring it to now.
But back then, here's the point. Back then, the debt to GDP held by the public was something like 30 or 35%. So a 1% rate hike, or in those cases, rate cut, but a 1% change in rates, a rate hike would have added maybe 35 basis points of income to the, percent of GDP to the economy, because the debt to GDP was like 30 or 35%. This time around, it's 100% roughly. Debt to GDP held by the public.
Yeah.
So a 1% increase in rates 2.5 years ago ultimately increased interest payments by a full 1% of GDP, 3 times the impact of the prior cycle. So here I am saying, look, if I thought this had an impact before, now it really has an impact. Okay, now it's 3 times larger than before. This is going to be far different than anybody can imagine. And raising rates this time around is going to have a strong supporting effect on aggregate demand, keeping unemployment down, total employment growing, that type of thing. And at the time they increased the rates, the Fed was rained, with criticism for engaging in policy that was going to cause unemployment to go up to fight inflation. Remember that?
Yeah, of course.
Well, and I'm going, no, they've got it backwards. This is going to bring unemployment down. This is going to bring total employment up. This is going to cause strong positive GDP growth, not a recession. Every forecast was for a recession for years, right? They were just ignoring this fiscal impact of this increase in deficit spending. Now, the only thing I could rationalize where they're getting this from is that they must have had deep in their model somewhere a zero propensity to spend interest income, right? No matter how high you raise rates, no matter how much interest you pay there, nobody's going to spend a dime of it, and so you don't have to worry about it. And that's why they look at the primary deficit when they talk about emerging markets. They don't even count the interest income expense, right? That's all I could come up with as to why they would ignore that channel.
Can we talk a little bit more about, I guess, the consumption avenue of the interest income channel? Because I will fully admit that it was very nice in circa 2022 to finally earn positive interest on my bank account. I'm an elder millennial, so that had basically never happened to me before. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that because I was earning, 2 to 5% on my savings, that I went out and bought a bunch of additional things. And of course, a lot of that was offset by the increased cost of living, increased price level, if we're not using the term inflation. So how do you see that aspect of it playing out? People are earning more income, but does that actually translate into more demand?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And that's a micro question. What you look at what all the individuals who are getting it do. Pension funds get treasury security, interest. How does that translate into aggregate demand? Foreigners get a lot of interest, and I hear all this, that look, none of this interest is going to get spent. And so it doesn't matter. You're wrong. We're going into recession. The interest rate effects on, borrowers is going to dominate, and that's going to take down the economy. And the answer is you can only look at the data and see what happens. We can both come up with a narrative of what we think the propensities to consume out of interest income are, but we're not going to know until after it happens. And I looked at in prior cycles, the data was telling me that it's not zero, that there's a substantial amount that directly or indirectly does get spent. But that's all it is. It's a view looking at the macro data, looking at what GDP did versus what it was expected to do, looking at how the rate cuts helped the economy or didn't help the economy, based on what their models expected, right? In the same way, those rate cuts didn't help the economy as expected back in 2009-ish, is telling me it was that $400 billion a year of income that was cut out was having a dampening effect on spending. It goes back to under Bush in 2001, when we hit that recession. They dropped interest rates to 1%, and nothing happened. It didn't help. And I was actually in a meeting with Andrew Card, who was chief of staff at the White House in 2002, February, March. And I'd gotten that meeting because in my car company, two of the people on the board of directors were ex-engineers, one General Motors, one Ford. They knew Card personally. He was an engineer at GM. And when I talked to him about the interest income thing, the same way I'm talking about it to you, they said, you got to talk to Andy and set up this meeting. I went to the White House. The meeting was in the West Wing. And the first thing I did was just what I said to you and look, in the economy itself, when they lowered interest rates, it helped borrowers, but it hurt savers, and to the penny. For every dollar saved, there's a dollar borrowed in the economy. Banks have loans and deposits, and they're equal, or somebody made an arithmetic mistake, assets and liabilities. And so, when you lower rates, you're just shifting income from one entity to another. And the only way that can have an effect is if there are differences in the propensities to spend interest income of those two. But at the macro level, because of the public debt, when you lower rates, you're cutting the size of the deficit, you're cutting total interest income in the economy. I said, I think that effect dominates. And looking at what happened in the last year in 2002, I wouldn't expect rates to do anything. And Card looks at it and he says, yeah, why would anybody think that's going to work? And he says, And he goes, oh, well, what does work? And then I explained the fiscal side, where when you spend more than you tax, that is a direct add of, income and net financial assets. And when you increase deficit spending proactively, any economist who pays to be right is going to revise his forecast upward for the economy. And he says, well, how much do we need? I said, well, I think it's probably $700 billion annually back then, which was maybe about 5% of GDP. And he says, well, we don't have much time, do we? I said, no. I said, well, we better get started. Got a nice note back from him. It was very nice. A week later, the president was asked about the deficit. And he said, look, I don't look at numbers on a piece of paper. I look at jobs, which came right out of our meeting. And after that, I don't know if you remember those days, but they passed every tax cut you could imagine, including retroactive tax cuts, something we never had before. People were getting tax refunds from taxes from previous years. And they passed every spending bill they could get through Congress, trying to get this deficit up to save the economy. And that included prescription drugs for Medicare. So I'll take personal responsibility, even though that wasn't discussed in the meeting, for the government spending all that money on prescription drugs. The deficit got up to $200 billion by the third quarter, which was about my target number, $700 billion for the year. The economy turned around, and it didn't cost him the election. So, I've been on this for a while. And it's all been from a narrative and then watching the data.
So mainstream macroeconomists have this concept that they call fiscal dominance. And that sounds like what you're describing, where and a
little bit, yeah.
So basically,
close enough.
Yeah, so close enough. So I actually maybe I'll try to get you in trouble with some of your MMT friends here, but it sounds to me that from a policy, look, if debt to GDP were currently at 10% right now, very low, and you raise rates, that you have some constraining effect on borrowers. And yes, you do have this increase in the interest income channel, but it's not that big of a deal because there just aren't many coupon payments at all that are going out relative to the size of the economy.
Exactly right.
But where we are right now, is it safe to say that the size of the debt is a problem, that we are in fiscal dominance, and that the size of the debt constrains the ability of monetary policy to be a balancing force in a time of inflation?
More than that, it made it backwards. It takes it away. Now, I had a discussion with Paul Krugman a few years ago, and that's when he and Stephanie Kelton were going at it with dueling editorial. Remember that?
Yeah, of course.
And I said to him, what's wrong with the job guarantee? And he says, well, if you deficit spend for the job guarantee, the deficit could get so large that if the Fed tried to raise, if we get inflation, the Fed won't be able to use interest rates as a tool because the interest expense will be so high that itself would cause inflation. Now, he was using that as an argument against the job guarantee. And he made my argument, and I said to him, I agree with you. I said, but I think we're already there for all practical purposes. And the debt to GDP was lower then, but it was at least neutral, that interest rates were a tool. And he disagreed with me, and that's fine. And I said, and in any case, I support, as you know, a permanent zero rate, in which case it's moot. You could deficit spend for job guarantee without worrying about whether raising rates is going to do anything or not, because you're not going to do it. You're going to just leave them at zero. But the point was, that was his new Keynesian, the position out of the new Keynesian model. And it was a standard new Keynesian position years, not that long ago. You remember them all talking about anti-deficit talk and how the interest payments are unsustainable and all this stuff. By unsustainable, they always mean inflationary, right? They don't say it in their first phrase, but that's, if you drill down on them, that's what they get to. But in the last couple of years, when I asked him again 2 years ago, it was like, no, I don't think we're at that level. I still think the Fed can raise rates to fight inflation. I said, okay, we'll see. So this is in the new Keynesian model. It's just arithmetic that at some point the deficit gets high enough, the public debt gets high enough, so that when you raise rates and pay more interest, you do the interest itself causes inflation. Now let's look at how high the deficit spending is. CBO's latest number shows 7% of GDP, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's just Treasury. I don't think that includes Fed remittances. So maybe it's 7.5 or something. Okay. Now, have we ever had anything anywhere near a 7% budget deficit during an expansion with the unemployment at like 4%, kind of record low levels? No. The only time we've gotten anywhere near this high is countercyclically, when you have a collapse and then tax revenues fall off and transfer payments kick in because unemployment's high. Then we got to 8 or 9% in 2009, and we got to, I don't know what the number was with COVID, maybe 15%. But normally, if you look at 2008, the budget deficit was down to something like 1% of GDP, and that was low enough to allow the high price of oil and the other catalysts to trigger a major collapse in the financial sector. Not a 7% deficit. 7% is like drunken sailor level of government spending. And out of that, 4% is the interest expense. It's over 1.2 trillion, I think, annually. We just passed 100 billion for the month. Wait. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so look, right now the deficit's 7% of GDP, 4% of which is interest expense. So without the interest expense, if they left rates at zero, it would have been trending towards zero, and the deficit would have been down at 2, 3, 4%, something still high, but not like it is now. And that, to me, is like, it's unthinkable that that's not going to support a strong economy. Now, what's interesting is in the last month, there's been a little bit of a bump in the numbers, right? The Fed Atlanta is down to 1.7% GDP growth, still not a recession or anything. And everybody's now looking for this collapse and Fed rate cuts and everything else. And I'm sitting here going, how can this be with a 7% pro-cyclical budget deficit? It seems like an absurd assumption that we could have any kind of substantial weakness, or really any kind of a sustained weakness in the price level. So, but for the last few weeks, maybe a month, a couple of months, it's certainly been plenty of indicators around the edges that things are weakening, and it may turn out, I'm completely wrong. We have a total economic collapse with a 7% deficit, and I'm 75 this year. You'll never hear from me again, right? So we'll see what happens.
That's a good hedge, the age hedge.
In the long run, we're all dead.
Right.
In the short run, I'll be dead before I have to answer for anything I say.
Wait.
Look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll be the first one to tell you that I've just totally caught out by a recession with a 7% deficit. Unless we get $150 oil or something like that. But man, absent some other shock, I don't see how that much can be spent without GDP being strongly positive, unemployment being very low, and price pressures. Now, the other interesting thing is this $100 billion a month only translates into about a 3.5% of the Treasury debt as interest payment, whereas Fed funds rate's 5.5, 5 3/8, which means, and T-bills are somewhere around there, 5 1/4, 5 3/8, which means that as rollovers continue, as time goes by, the deficit expands, that number's going up. Oh. Okay, even if they just leave rates alone, it will get to 5 3/8, asymptotically, but it'll get there. And so that we're getting more and more of this, and the CBO's deficit forecasts are showing deficits higher than 6% out into the future. Like, this is like going to be interesting. That to me is at least 6-7% nominal growth. And if you think, price level is going to be, I don't know what you want to use, PCE or something at 2.5, that's 4.5 real, right? That's a pretty strong number. More likely you will get 2 to 3 real, and the rest will be, price level changes, which is one of the channels where the interest rate normally, or over time, I've just noticed over 50 years, the change in the price level, the rate of inflation, gravitates towards the Fed's policy rate over time. They converge. And so with a 5.5% rate, 5 3/8 rate, you'll see CPI gravitating towards that interest rate, towards that number, 5.5. Not in day one. You can go months without it, but over longer periods of time. And you can think of that something like a stock split, or a stock dividend, where if you just pay out more shares, you're getting, all else equal, the value of an individual share goes down by that amount, right? So if you have a 2-for-1 stock split, the price of the stock falls in half. If you're paying out 5.5% a year on the public debt, which is the net financial assets in the economy, called the net money supply in the economy, you're expanding it at 5.5% a year through payment of interest. There's nothing on the supply side. It's just a distribution. Then I've just observed that over time, the price level gravitates upward by about that amount. And there's, plus or minus. So those are my expectations going forward. And if you notice, CPI has leveled off at about 3.25% or something. It went up with COVID, it came down, and then sort of leveled off. It's been going sideways here. And that's about at the interest rate. The effective rate on treasuries last year was about 3.5, whatever it was. So to me, that's not a coincidence. It's not a surprise. It doesn't have to happen. It could have been different, but it's kind of like the midpoint of my expectations as to what's going to happen with the price level. Now, PCE is a different thing, right? That includes substitution. If the price of steak goes up and so people eat chicken instead, but spend the same amount, then there hasn't been any increase in the PCE.
Just to be clear, we're recording this on a day that I've incurred something of a substantial head injury, and I was in the emergency room until late at night. But did I just hear the Godfather of MMT say that large deficits can be a problem? Is that what you just said? I feel like I might be hallucinating that.
Well, the deficit itself is just a accounting residual, but this, the spending in any given year, any spending has consequences. If they decided to spend $1 trillion to buy eggs, they're going to drive up the price of eggs, right? So if the government's spending on our government spends on a quantity constrained basis, let's say, they decide what they want to buy and then pay whatever they have to buy it.
Yeah.
That can drive up, it does drive up prices or down price, all the time. That's constantly changing relative value in the economy of all kinds of things. There's no way about that. And we have coercive taxation, right? And the tax structure affects prices and affects things. So if we have right now major tax credits for solar, for example, I think I get a 40% tax credit for installing solar. So I'm putting solar panels in, and the USVI, the electricity is 45 cents a kilowatt. So it's a pretty easy calculation. So I wouldn't have put in without that tax incentive from the government. So I figure it's probably not just me. So I talked to people at accounting firms, major accounting firms. Are you seeing tax time people doing this? And they go, oh, yeah, we've got our own partnerships and structures where you can put money in and participate in this solar tax credit. So who knows how large this open-end tax credit's getting and what it's affecting. So, yes, government spending, but fiscal policy is entirely distributional between tax liabilities and spending. It's pushing and pulling, everything everywhere. It's a major determinant. It's a large part of the command economy, and it's a command economy, to the extent that it's there. If the government decides it wants jet planes, it's going to get jet planes.
Right.
Through the tax structure to the spending structure. The free market would not be producing jet planes without the government ordering.
Right.
Everything caters to these forces of government that are just on us all the time. So it's not that I'm in favor of them, but I'm just recognizing them and what they do.
It sounds like, so you used the term drunken sailor, which thank you, because maybe that'll go at the headline of this episode. It sounds like the issue is, so a lot of spending, yes, that creates a lot of, the more spending, the more demand, prices go up. And then it sounds
if you spend at market prices.
Yeah, if you spend
based on at a fixed price, if you say, look, I'm only going to spend this much for labor, you can't drive prices up.
Right.
You might not get any, but you're not going to drive prices up.
Yeah,
that makes sense. You might get a lot,
the government
but you're not going to
orders
drive prices up.
The government orders tanks and jets, and it also guarantees Social Security recipients a certain fixed level of inflation or price level adjusted consumption capacity.
And then we become agents. Because I get Social Security of the government.
Right.
And with no restrictions on what we do when we spend it.
But it basically sounds like it's that mix of sort of conventional macro thinking in which high rates is disinflationary. plus the high levels of government spending. That seems to be the cocktail for both higher upward pressure on the price level, and it sounds like over time worsening higher price level because there's a compounding effect.
Yeah, and that's the situation at the moment. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's what I see happening like right now.
In that context, and you sort of touched on this before, but I would love to hear a sort of like play-by-play guide here. But what should the central bank be doing in the current environment where we do have high fiscal deficits that might end up, constraining them?
So if they cut rates to zero tomorrow, then the CBO would score it as like 20 trillion of reduced, fiscal spending, budget cutting, or whatever over 10 years, probably. Like the largest spending cut in the history of America times 10, just by cutting rates to zero. All right, and that's got to have unless you assume none of that's going to get, nobody's going to change their spending because 1.2 trillion of income has been taken away. But looking at the numbers I'm looking at, that's going to have a massive deflationary bias to it. It's going to be taking away all that income and all those net financial assets from the economy. It's going to be a staggering creation of fiscal space, let's say. I don't know how you want to put it, but just a major deflationary event. And it's not even under consideration. It would be considered a major inflationary event.
Right.
That's why look at all the people that have looked at Japan with their zero rates and forecasts like hyperinflation. The yen went through 160. Big deal, right? Their inflation rate's lower than ours. It didn't go up, and they kept zero rates the whole time. But they're still forecasting hyperinflation. So they've got this bias that the low rates are going to, a rate cut like that would be inflationary when it's the opposite.
Well, actually, since you brought up Japan, I started really paying attention to this stuff in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
And, I heard all the tales of the widowmaker trade and everyone betting on that hyperinflation and how it never happens. In recent years, Japan has seen, like the rest of the world, a substantial inflationary impulse, still low by international standards, but the stock of the national debt in Japan is very high. As we all know. And now they actually, for the first time in forever, have actually seen inflation. Again, not that high, but again, historically by Japanese standards. Is there a potent mix right now for Japan? Is there a risk that, I don't know about hyperinflation, kind of seems unrealistic, that actually if they follow conventional macro thinking and could hold rates up or move rates up to fight this inflation, that some of these disaster scenarios might actually emerge with the size of the debt?
Well, ironically, they entirely embrace conventional macro theory. And the reason they're keeping rates down is they're worried that they might not actually be out of deflation. And so they've got to keep rates down to ensure that the inflation stays, somewhere towards 2. And they just had, numbers from Tokyo or something that showed a lower rate, and they're all panicking about a deflation. So they're there for the wrong reason, so to speak, but they're there. So we have the data, okay. Does that answer your question?
But if they were to raise, if some point there's like, oh no, the inflation's not, if they were to raise, could that create some real unfortunate dynamic feedback loops given the stock of the Japanese debt?
If they ever decided to raise rates to do something with their debt to GDP, they'd be throwing gasoline on the fire the way we have, except, twice as much.
Yeah.
Wait, could we talk a little bit more? So we've obviously been focused on the interest income channel for good reason, but can we talk a little bit about the credit channel?
And the impact, this is important.
And the impact of higher rates there, because the standard economic theory is that rates go up and that makes the cost of credit, that increases the cost of credit for businesses, and so they cut back on their spending
and investment.
How do you view that component of interest rate function?
Well, their clients of the businesses are getting flooded with interest income and buying their output at whatever price they need, which includes what you need to, for investment to keep up your output, right? And to train your personnel and do whatever else you need. Their prices are at levels where they're sustainable, where they can pay interest expense if they need to. And so we're seeing, it's not this quarter, but we've seen, 3 and 4% GDP numbers. Now, first and second quarter seem to be a little bit weak. I don't know if there's something in the seasonals that aren't quite fully sorted out, but and might prove me wrong, but I think the first quarter was 1.4, right, due to inventory selling off inventories because they believed the economy wasn't going to be strong, so they didn't replace their inventories. Now they have to replace them. We'll see what happens in the second quarter. But anyway, so that's a narrative that you had, but the data hasn't played out because the income of their clients has been high enough to buy their output at a price that they like, that they're comfortable with. They've had good pricing power, and it covers these added expenses from the interest expenses and interest-related expenses that you were talking about.
But
so if you're spending enough, you're throwing enough gasoline on the fire, it's going to burn.
But so just on the private sector side a little bit more, as one of the key themes that you talk about is these are distributional questions, or the effects of a lot of these policies are distributional. And you mentioned maybe economists think there's no propensity to consume interest income, and maybe there's some good reasons for that because it's, most the wealthy people own the treasuries and banks and stuff like that. But there's consumer credit, there's cars. We know that housing has slowed down. It does seem housing has slowed down substantially. It does seem like there are many parts of the U.S. economy, that have
there are winners and losers.
That they have responded to these higher rates by diminishing their activity.
Yes, there are winners and losers. And if you just look at the losers, you could maybe conclude by projection or confirmation bias that the whole country's losing. But it's not. It's just shifting to different areas. Rolls-Royce has 2, 3, 4 year backlog of sales, right?
And you would jets,
know. Yeah. Yeah, I read it in the Wall Street Journal. I'm in Bloomberg. I read it on Bloomberg.
Oh, thank you.
What are you driving these days? What race car are you driving these days?
I've been driving a 2015 Nissan Leaf electric car for a while, because on the island you can't 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. And
but what do you drive on the track?
I haven't been on the track since I turned since I turned 52, I think.
Oh, okay.
So I don't race on the track anymore.
Got it.
But I used to drive things that burn gasoline. I had my own cars. I had the Mosler MT900, which I would run on track days. I never ran at real races. I used professional drivers, but in amateur racing, I would drive it, and I would drive our Consuliers. And I used to say these cars can win races even with me driving.
We should another episode. Would you ever come back to talk about when you had a race car, your car company?
Sure.
Oh,
yeah, that'd be fun.
That'd be really fun.
This looks like a sweet car. The Mosler M2. This is beautiful. How many of them were made? This is a beautiful car.
There were 50 or 60, and I stopped making the MT900s in 10, 15 years ago. But so they're still racing. So like in the Spanish GT and the British GT, they're still winning races. Against the latest and greatest. And, the car is 20 years old. So there's still the top performance car in the world where they let them run.
So just going back to interest rates for a second, moving
away
from...
that seems way more boring now than looking at race cars.
I know. This question is inevitably going to fall flat, but it does feel like we're sort of talking about the economy is not a monolith. So you have these interest rate sensitive portions of the economy like housing that are affected by rate rises. And then you have pockets that are more insensitive. And maybe we don't have the balance of those two things exactly right. Or maybe traditional economics hasn't done a good job of taking those individual portions of the economy and netting them out into a cohesive picture of the actual effect of interest rates on them. How do you I guess this has always been sort of a criticism of MMT, but how do you take those disparate ideas and sort of make them into a useful theory of economics? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, look, the whole composition of GDP changes all the time. And it's driven, as I touched on before, quite a bit by fiscal policy, deciding what the government wants. So if the government wants more solar panels, it puts a big tax credit, unlimited tax credit. We'll see how large that is, when the smoke clears. But I think it's going to be a lot larger than anybody realized. If you notice, government revenues have been flat in a booming economy. That's never happened. It's got to be tax credits of some sort, working out there. So the composition is going to follow the money. And if the money's going to those, earning interest, then that's where the composition is going to go. And you'll see more high-end purchases. You'll see more things that sort that group of people. There'll be, all kinds of investments in that direction. And that's what we're seeing. So again, it's about following the money, and the government policy directs to a large extent where the money goes. And right now, we've got over $1 trillion a year going to interest income, which is more than defense and more than Social Security and everything else, right?
I just have one last question, and this is more in the category of Warren Mosler lore rather than it is in interest rates. But we're in the studio right now, and I looked up and I saw on Fox Biz, which we have on TV, Art Laffer is on there. Isn't it true, you were friends with him? Isn't there some story with you and Art where you had some important insight that led you to MMT thinking from a chat with Art?
Well, I was looking for somebody to write up what became Soft Currency Economics, the first thing I wrote. This was in 1993. And I went to my ex-boss, Ned Giannata from William Blair, and he sent me over to Rummy. Don Rumsfeld was his 1954 Princeton, roommate. They were on a football team or wrestling team or something together. And they had been good friends. So I had a meeting. I called his office, and he was real busy. The only time he had was an hour in the steam room at the Racket Club in Chicago. So I went out and met him there. So we're sitting in our towels in the steam room going through Soft Currency Economics. And he then gave me a list of his economists that he thought would be good places for me to go. And Art Laffer was on that list. And his guys were like Paul McCracken and Samuelson. I mean, these were not anybody on my Rolodex. And I contacted a few of them, and Laffer agreed to do it in exchange for $25,000 would help me write this thing. And he assigned Mark McNary. So I got to know Art a little bit, and because we talked quite a bit on these things. And it turns out he's an University of Chicago professor, and he knew all this stuff. He knew Lerner and functional finance, and long before I met any of the academic community. And, he agreed with it. He assigned Tom Nugent to cover me because he was always looking to do business. I went to a little conference where he got up to talk, and he said, I'm going to give the talk on money. And I'm going to tell the money story. He says, and Tom and Warren, and he points to us, disagree with me. He said, and they're right and I'm wrong, but this is the way I tell it. And he went and told the story about how banks take in deposits and make loans, completely backwards. And then he finishes the talk, and we look at him like, what was that? He says, well, I told everybody you were right and I was wrong. He said, what do you want? It's like, okay. So I don't know what's going on with Art Laffer. But he did say the problem with the Laffer curve was it only worked at the very extremes. So he was very, reasonable about everything. He's a very, easy guy to talk to and, self-deprecating in many ways. And, it worked out well. Mark was very good. And he wrote and I edited it. He wrote and I edited and did it. We came up with the Soft Currency Economics thing. And it didn't help. I thought having Laffer's name on it and whatnot might give it more attention, more media attention, but I don't think it made any difference. But as they say, you have to kiss a lot of frogs, and that was just one of those times.
Warren Mosler, so great to have you on. I swear I would honestly love to do an episode just about Mosler Automotive and just talk about the business.
I just want to hear a day in the life of Warren Mosler as well.
Okay, so Joe, let me go in my fog. We met at a dinner at UMKC maybe or something?
Yeah, I was at UMKC
okay.
I think it was 2015. No, it couldn't have been 2015. 2012 or 2013. That sounds right.
Yeah, it's long ago where I don't remember what it was.
Those were fun days. But so great to finally have you on the podcast and enjoy wherever you're going to be vacationing next.
Okay. Thanks. Take care.
Tracy, the Godfather of MMT, says the government is spending like drunken sailors and that it's contributing to inflation.
I'm still not entirely convinced that this isn't like a hallucinatory output.
Oh yeah, from your forehead,
from my head injury. But wow, okay. I mean, I do think it is not hard for me to envision a world in which companies pass on higher interest rate costs to consumers. Like we've talked on the show about companies passing on higher input costs and things like that. So that part of it, I can believe. And the other part that does seem intuitive to me right now is this idea of a tiered economy where people who do have a lot of financial assets and are earning a lot of income on those financial assets do spend on certain things, like, as Warren mentioned, luxury items. Like a lot of that makes intuitive sense.
So definitely. And look, here's where, like, I think I would need more exploration. So there are aspects of it, like, clearly interest income is a real thing. More deficit spending, which more interest income entails, is on the net going to be stimulative at the margin. But rich people or people with financial assets also just care about the price of their financial assets.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we did see, they really jacked up rates aggressively in 2022 and stocks did decline. And I think stock prices probably influence real estate prices. They've certainly, we haven't had a housing crash, but real estate in many realms has been stagnant. Or if you're in multifamily or commercial real estate, then you probably have seen some price declines and so I do think that, like, that is an offsetting factor. And then I also think that while it's certainly true probably that the propensity to spend interest income is not zero, it is probably somewhat low, given that we're talking about people who already have a lot of money and income, whereas the propensity to spend among people who are paying high interest rates, either through car payments or credit card payments, etc., is probably much higher and therefore impaired by higher rates. So while I certainly get the theory, and I think there's probably something to it, I still would need a little bit more convincing that the distributional effect of this change in spending is on net inflationary. But it's interesting ideas.
Absolutely. I think that's a really fair assessment. And I think the composition of wealth matters. So you can say that there are all these treasuries in the world. I can't remember the exact number, but $30 trillion or something like that. And people earn income on those treasuries, but each individual person is probably not holding a pure treasury portfolio. As you say, personal wealth will be comprised of real estate, which is affected by higher interest rates, stocks, which also go up and down depending on interest rates. And so, it seems like there's a sort of there's a compositional complexity there that we still need to work out.
And speaking of financial assets that go down, the treasuries themselves.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And as you learn the first day you join Bloomberg, when rates go up, price goes down.
That's right. We should start adding that into all of our news stories again, we used to, just to hammer this point home.
When price yields up, price it down. I also just really I do want to do an episode on Warren Mosler lore, because he kind of seems like a really cool guy who has a fun life.
We should go to the island and
go
hang
to
out
the
with
island. Him. The Mosler MT900 looks absolutely sick.
Wait,
have you not looked?
No.
Look at that up. That's
Mosler...
I'm not a car guy, but that's
wow.
a sick looking car that he built,
isn't
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's no joke. That is a sick looking car.
The one on Wikipedia is a very bright green.
It's beautiful.
Okay. Shall we leave it there? Should we stop admiring race cars and leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks. Thank you to our producer, Moses Andam. For more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots, where we have transcripts, a blog, and a newsletter. And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord. A lot of MMT fans in there, so it'll be interesting to see how they react. Go to discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you like it when we talk heterodox economics, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, you can listen to all of our episodes absolutely ad-free. All you need to do is connect your Bloomberg account with Apple Podcasts. In order to do that, just find the Bloomberg channel on Apple Podcasts and follow the instructions there. Thanks for listening.